Hello, my name is Hakon and welcome back to my channel and another little video today about my new poetry collections now available on Amazon. And my previous video, I just made the announcement that these were available. Today I wanted to say a few more words about them. First of all though, first things first, for those who have watched a few of my videos, you may have noticed that there are no adverts in front, in the middle, or after my videos. That is because my channel is not monetized, and that also means that I don't make a single penny from creating all this content for you, unless you lovely viewers decide to support me in some kind of way, whether it's to join me on Patreon, buy me a coffee, buy a piece of music on Bandcamp, buy an art print on pixels.com, and now also to buy my poetry collections for yourself or someone you love, etc. And it would be highly appreciated, of course, if you do any of those things, and to encourage me to keep doing what I do, and also enabling me in some cases to do what I do on this channel, because if I don't make money from it, of course I won't make as many videos because I have to do other things as well. So as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to say a few more words about my poetry collections, some of the choices I made, a little bit about them, about the poems as well, maybe just very briefly today. I'm not going to go too much in depth because I would make too long a video, of course, but I will also keep making my videos where I present one poem at a time, talk a bit about it, and there will be more mentions of details to do with specific poetry in those videos. First of all, I'll talk a little bit about size. So when I published my poetry in 2004, this is the size of the poetry books that I published at the time. That is 6 by 9 inches, and my new ones are 5 by 8 inches. Now, at the time that I published these, 6 by 9 inches was your standard mass market paperback print on demand format, and if you wanted your book to be available on Amazon at the time, that was the size it had to be. Not longer the case. Of course, now I'm publishing through Amazon itself, through their program called Amazon KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, which also is for print publications, paperbacks and hardbacks, and also comic books, I believe, and which allows me to get a print size that is 5 by 8. That is the smallest size, I believe, that was available. And I think this is very close to the perfect size for a poetry collection. 6 by 9 I think is too big. 5 by 8 I think is almost exactly the perfect size. And also another thing that consideration I had, and this is also one of the reasons why I have 3 collections and not just one, is I wanted them to be a certain thickness as well. Now, I think there's a lot to be said about making a poetry collection that is the right size to be read in one sitting if you want to. And of course, you can also spread it out a little bit, which I think is a good idea. Let the words digest a little bit, as it were, intellectually. And but I wanted to make it possible and comfortable and not too intimidating to feel that you couldn't read these poetry collections in a single sitting if you wanted to. So each of these collections have 55 poems. I'm not sure if one of them maybe has 56, but 55 I believe is the number, and they all have 125 pages as well, I believe, 126 possibly, I suppose. And I think this is a really good size for a poetry collection. It makes it easier to find on the bookshelf to have this size and not smaller. And just to exemplify that, I also have here, just as an example, I have Leonard Cohen's Let Us Compare Mythologies, his first collection in a reprint. And as you can see, it's almost just a little bit larger than half the size of this. This is about 70 pages and this is 125. I think this is too small. It easily disappears on the bookshelf in between other books. The spine text is so small you can't read it really comfortably, and so I think this is close to the ideal size. And this is the kind of size I will keep aiming for when I publish future collections. I will try to make them all roughly the same page count, and to make them look nice together as well, for my own sake, because my sense of aesthetics dictates that I want these to look nice together on the bookshelf. So that's one consideration I had when I chose this particular format. Now, that also led to the exact format led to another thing, which is the font size. So I am a big fan of text that is a little bit larger than your standard novel paperback print size text. I am of a certain age where when using reading glasses becomes an actual thing, and I like reading books that I can read without using reading glasses, and so I decided to see if I could do that, and I ended up on a kind of compromise size that is actually quite large, and larger than what you usually get in poetry collections. Indeed, I've actually gone to the shop and looked at poetry collections, and I often see that the text in many of them it's just simply way smaller than it needs to be. I've made this as big as I can while still accommodating the longest line of any of the poems in these 3 books on a single line. And that gave me 12.5 points of text size in a very comfortable to read, nice classical Garamond font. And also I did about roughly 1.5 line spacing, and I think I also extended the text just a tiny bit, 0.1 points I think left to right as well, just to space it out just a little bit more, and make the letters a little bit less squashed and make it easier and more legible and more comfortable on the eye as you read. Another thing I have done, which you can actually see quite right here as well, and this is of course one way to add to the page count. Instead of having what is usually the standard, which is 1 new poem on each new page, or that when you start a new poem, you start a new page, I've had each new poem start on a new spread. So they all start on the left side, and if it's too small to fill 2 pages, it is on the 1 page and it has a blank page on the right. The reason I've done this is twofold. First of all, I wanted to get up to that 125 page length without having too much content, too many poems. And also, I like that it's not that you don't get distracted when you're reading. So when I read a poem, I want to read it slowly, deliberately. I want to feel every single syllable, sound and line, and I want to read it out loud. I want to think about it. I want to feel it. I want to do all those things. And when I do that, I don't want distractions. So one way that I thought would be as distraction free as possible, and this is just my own preference, this is how I would want other people to publish their poetry as well. I'm not going to impose that on anyone, but this is how I would have preferred other people's poetry. 1 poem per spread. New poems always on its own spread. It doesn't actually add that many pages. Many of my poems do go across 2 pages. And it doesn't add to the cost for the consumer, the end consumer, you, because the print cost is relatively low and the sale price would have been the same if I had had fewer pages. So I make a little bit less, but you get a book that is a more comfortable size, fewer distractions, nice big type, and a good size to find on the bookshelf. So it's a win-win-win for you, I think, and I think you'll appreciate the choices that I have made when it comes to the layout. Now, Another thing that I've done, which is a one that might seem a little bit obscure to some of you, but some of you will be familiar with a type of poem called a sonnet. And if you're familiar with sonnets, which of course are made famous by people like Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare, so like a Renaissance kind of form of poetry, it's a very formal, a relatively formalized style of poetry, just like a haiku is. It has a specific length, a sonnet, and often a sort of a thematic thing that is common to lots of sonnets, and also a structure that is relatively rigorous. So just to show you now, this is a sonnet in breadth of time. This actually is breadth of time. Normally, a sonnet is printed as one block of text. I have chosen to print it as 3 sections of 4 lines each, and then the couplet at the end. So just to go through the formal style of a sonnet, it is 14 lines, and it comes first in 3 groupings of 4 lines, which I do believe are called quatrains. And then there is a rhyming couplet at the end. This is a Shakespearean sonnet. That is the style of a Shakespearean sonnet. And also there is always 10 syllables to the line. And the rhyme scheme is such that you have the first line rhyming with a third, second with a fourth, fifth with a seventh, etc. So each of these groupings of 4 lines make a kind of single unit, very similar to a stanza or a verse. And in my sonnets, that is usually the case. Another feature of a sonnet that isn't always followed is that the first 2 quatrains establish what the sonnet is about, and then the third one moves something along further. So maybe it tries to start drawing conclusions based on the first 2. For instance, the first 2 could be establishing some kind of situation from the past. The third quatrain could be the present. So there's some kind of tonal change very often in the third quatrain. It's known as the volta, I believe. So it's like a turning point, just as a kind of dramatic structure you would often have in plays, for instance. They also have a kind of a volta, a turning point. And the last 2 lines, they rhyme with each other. It's a rhyming couplet, and that's kind of the conclusion of the poem. Sometimes it is a change in perspective that makes you look at whatever was in the poem in a different way. So, which is also quite a common dramatic feature of a play or a novel or a short story, that right at the end, you sort of turn things around a bit and you try to change perspective. That's not always the case, but it's sort of one of those things you can do with a format like this that actually makes it quite a nice format. And because it's restricted by its size, it's you have to work sometimes a bit with it to make it all flow really well and try to get the structure right. And it can be a challenge. It can be quite fun to work within such constraints. So I've chosen to write those out as if they are three verses of 4 lines and then a last one of 2. So people might not immediately recognize them as sonnets, but they are sonnets. It's just a different way of writing them out. One more thing that I wanted to do in my poetry collections that I quite like. No, I have seen many poetry collections that are published, so that's sort of single collections like these, that have a table of contents, and to me that feels a little bit weird. So when I'm starting to read a new poetry collection, the first thing I see when I go into it it feels a bit strange to go into a table of contents. A table of contents, to me, that feels like what you should have for an anthology or for a factual book, a textbook, things like that. But it's still nice to be able to refer back to poems that you have read before, and so I have included at the end an index of titles and first lines, and of course you can put both of those in the same index by making, in my case, I've chosen to do titles in normal text and first lines as italics. So I've got that at the end of all 3 of my books. So those are the main typographical layout concerns that I've tried to address. So it's the size, the thickness, the format, how it looks on the shelf, and the size of the font, things like that, trying to make it legible and clear. Okay. What else is there to say about them? Well, I was going to say a few words about thematic groupings. So normally, in many people, when they publish poetry collections, they have some kind of theme, or they have different themes that go through the book. And in my case, when I published my poetry back in 2004 and 2001, I wasn't sure exactly how to group them thematically. Many of them dealt with the same kind of thing. It dealt with emotions, with processing emotions, with love, grief, sorrow, sometimes with war, different things. And I ended up doing something that in hindsight felt a little bit silly to me, because I grouped them, I sorted them alphabetically. So in a single, each of these older poetry collections that I have, the poems in them are sorted alphabetically, which seems like a very contrived kind of formalism that I think actually distracts potentially from the poems, and a completely random order that isn't alphabetical, I think, is definitely preferable to that. So in my republishing now, I deliberately made sure not to make it alphabetical. One thing I did, however, as a way to organize them, is that I try to alternate a little bit between the poems that now take more than one page with the ones that take one page, so you don't have large groupings of one or the other necessarily, so it looks a little bit more normal, a little bit more balanced. Otherwise, there are a few thematic groupings. But first of all, let's just to talk about there's a sort of slight chronological grouping going on as well. So the first of these collections, there is actually an order to them, is 1994. And the year implies, it's a reference to the fact that 1994 was the year that I started writing poems that I thought personally were actually good. I started writing poetry on purpose in November 1992. I'll say some more about that later. Before that, I had written poetry, but just a few. And of course, I was just writing some rhyming couplets and things when I was a child, just for fun. And I wrote something in school one time for a school assignment. They don't really count. I started writing poetry on purpose. I decided I wanted to write a poem November 1992. But even though I'd written maybe 10, 20 poems during 1992, 93, and into the beginning of 1994, I was of the opinion already that I was a kind of a poet. I wanted to write poetry. I was aware, perhaps not that keenly, that my poetry wasn't particularly great, but when May 1994 came along and I wrote what until then was by far my best poem, that's when I realized I could sort of rate the ones I'd written before in a kind of more objective way, and realized that they had certain shortcomings. And I had a kind of a sort of an epiphany as to how to write a poem in a better way. And I think my writing improved hugely, although still it had certain shortcomings, and I'll get back to those later. So just to talk about what I was originally starting to say something about now in the chronological order, which is sort of a semi-chronological order, I should say, is that many of the poems in this book were written in 1994 and 1995. And the next book, 3 Words, many of these were written when I was in the Navy, so 1997 until 99, mostly because that's when I wrote the most, but until 2001 really. And in Breaths of Time, I have, for instance, the sonnet Breaths of Time itself, which is the title poem of the collection, was written in 2018. And I have some other ones here that were written later as well. So many of the ones that were written after 2004 that were never included in the earlier collections are actually in this book. But all three books have poems that go all the way back to 1994 that have been updated, extended, and modified and renewed in some kind of fashion to be included in these three collections. And so the chronologicality of it isn't absolute. It's a very wishy-washy, fuzzy kind of thing, and nowhere absolute at all. But many other ones from the earlier days are in 1994. So there is another grouping as well that, and of course, because of the grouping or the order of them being somewhat chronological, that means that some of the poems that relate to certain life events end up being relatively grouped together. But the thing about the way that I've been writing poetry from the get-go, really, or when I started writing good poetry in 1994, is that very quickly, even though many of the poems actually refer to specific events in my life or to specific people, I always try to make them a little bit generic, in the sense that they don't necessarily have to apply just to me and just to that other person for whom I had feelings, etc., whatever the case might be. And of course, when you write about moments that impress on you some kind of feeling that you want to express in poetry, it could be the sunset, those kinds of things. I mean, all that romantic nonsense. Then, of course, when you write about it, you are trying to not just describe that one moment and how it made you feel, but in a way try to say something universal at the same time. So, and so they might be rooted in they might be inspired by a certain moment and a certain event and a certain person, but in many ways they're not really necessarily any longer about that one moment, that one person, that one emotion. And another thing about poetry in general, is that, of course, very often you have when you write poetry about your own experiences, it is very common to write it in the first person singular. So it's very often it's I this and I that, and then if you are talking about a specific person, you might often use you, second person singular, of course. And but the thing is that when you write poetry or you write anything at all, really, it's very easy for people when they read poetry to think that the first person singular of a poem is necessarily the writer. But of course, even though it is inspired by something that is an experience that is mine, that is very personal, and sometimes it starts out being a description of something that is entirely personal and subjective, because I'm trying to express something universal at the same time. And as I work on the poem, sometimes what happens in it, or what is described in it, starts to deviate from the actual experience that was mine and turn into something more fictional. So it sometimes feels a bit strange when you see poetry grouped under fiction, but it is, and of course it is very often autobiographical, but it also is semi-autobiographical in the sense that it starts out as something that is personal and your own experience, and then it can merge, gradually morph into something else. And that's another thing, that leads me actually into another thing now, because so to get back to 1992, so that's the year I started writing poetry. The reason I started writing poetry is because I wanted to understand my own emotions. And just to, yeah, how do I begin this story? So that's just to say, I was at the time in my life, 1992, so that I would have been 18 years. So I was 18 years old, and I was at a time in my life when I had a few occasions in a row that I would fall quite deeply in love with someone. To the point that I was actually struggling to understand exactly how this emotion worked, what kind of significance it had for me or for someone else. And of course, this was not the proper kind of love that you actually are together with someone. This was your shy person's love at a distance kind of love. So I would be in love with someone, they wouldn't necessarily know about it. But I was getting to the point where I was more and more able to express also to the other person, even if it was in a subtle way, and not usually in an explicit way, that I was in love with them. They might have realized, of course, long before I told them. And or without me telling them ever, for instance. So I had a few in a row that of those things. And of course, the thing is, when you're that age, everything you feel can be quite strong. It can be quite overwhelming. You're in a phase of your life where it is hard to understand your own emotions or the emotions of others. And for me, I think one of the things that troubled me about these feelings is that I didn't understand them fully. And I think that actually made me a little bit scared and uncertain about myself. Because I think in hindsight that I actually had a kind of need to express everything in words to understand it. I was able to express a lot of things in words, except the only thing I couldn't express in words was my own emotions. And so writing poetry became a way for me to try to express my own emotions, these kinds of things that generally cannot really be expressed fully in words. But of course, the thing about poetry is that it is a way to express the inexpressible by redefining the language and the words you use in a poem to express something more than those words will normally denote. That's one of the definitions of poetry, and I'll talk more about that in some other videos. So a poem is the kind of transcendent way of expressing something that cannot normally be expressed. And so by writing poetry, I was sort of gradually able to grasp and understand my own emotions. But of course, the thing about writing is, of course, at some point, it might also become its own purpose as well. And so you actually quite enjoy perhaps the writing of the poetry more than the emotions, which is a strange kind of thing. I actually wrote a poem about this as well recently. That's one of the new ones that I wrote as I was working on these collections. I'm not going to read it out to you now, but the general gist of it is that it's about the character in the poem, I should say, is someone who he asks to be hurt. He asks to be spurned. He wants to be hurt by this person he loves because it allows him to write about love and life. And he wants to wallow in that misery, sort of keep that feeling of hurt with him because it is what inspires him to write more. And this is a sentiment that I actually even before I started writing poetry myself, I believe, or around the same time, there is the poem by a Norwegian poet. I believe it's Welhaven is his name, Johann Sebastian Welhaven. I don't have the poem anywhere written down, but I do remember this from Norwegian class. And in this poem, he was deeply, deeply in love with a girl who died of tuberculosis very young. She was probably just 30 or something like that. And that was sort of the big love of his life. And in one of his poems, he says that he wants to keep his sorrow. And there was something in that line that quite resonated with me. I sort of keep his sorrow. Why does he want to keep his sorrow? And I think it actually struck me really quickly that he wanted to keep his sorrow because that is what he needed to write. And so I thought that was quite inspirational. So I did write a poem that's one of the kernels of inspiration to that particular poem. And also I realized in myself, of course, because as part of this emotional journey, or this journey of trying to express my emotions that I was going through in the years 1992 through 1995 particularly, is that I realized when I was experiencing being hurt that enabled me to write more. So it's almost like the main thing, the first mover of writing poetry, the first thing that spurs you into writing it is the sensation of something not being quite right. There's something you're yearning for. So by being in love, you're yearning for the person you love, that you're in love with. If that had been a happy kind of love, you actually are together with a person, that would have been completely different. You would have had no reason, I would have had no reason to write poetry about it, because the expressions of those emotions that I might have had would have come out in whatever me and her would have done together as boyfriend and girlfriend. That wasn't the case. I didn't do that because I wasn't together with anyone. So I had this love inside me for someone, silly as it may have been, of course, but of course that's the kind of age I was. And I was trying to express it, and I was feeling unfulfilled. I was longing for something, yearning for something, hoping for something, dreaming of something. And all those things it's something that you can only do when you have a certain distance to it as well. So I was trying to understand it, but only from the viewpoint of actually not experiencing it as well. So I mean, not fully experiencing the emotions, but not experiencing the fulfillment of those emotions. So that's something that I can only imagine. And of course, you write poems also about the imagined fulfillment of those emotions that you have. So that's the yearning. And I think I was talking about this with a friend of mine around the same time, and I think we agreed, I think in many ways, that you could call it a kind of home longing. So home longing is a word that we use to express this kind of yearning for a state of being where you are happy. And so almost everything can be brought back to home longing. So every fear, every yearning, every dream, etc., to wanting to be in that state of, this is where you feel at home, metaphorically speaking. So so it's all that together. Now there's another thing that happened in this period when I had a little short but significant string of falling in love, and that love being unrequited and unfulfilled, and often just kept a secret. And that is, my mother died. And this is something that I probably would have spent more time processing if it hadn't been for the being in love thing that I was doing at the same time. So I think that is something that actually I in some way put off a little bit. Now, at the time, which I think made it easier for me to deal with emotionally. I mean, the loss of a mother, it's quite a radical thing. But at the time, I'd been reading a lot about Taoism, and reading about Taoism made it easier for me to move on very quickly, because the thing is that if you have some kind of understanding of Taoist philosophy, I think that the thing about existence is that it is quite fragile, but life goes on, kind of thing as well. So of course, one minute you're alive, the other minute you're dead, and if you go on grieving about it, if you're still alive and somebody else is dead, then of course you might end up not enjoying your own life. And although I think grief is really good, and I definitely did, I just did grieve. I just didn't understand how I was grieving or that I was grieving sometimes. Um, it meant that I actually didn't process it as much as I probably should have done at the time. And it's only much later I think about. I can actually time this rather well. I think it's about 15 years later that it struck me that I actually hadn't processed my mother dying so much as I should have done back at the time. But I was so emotionally immature. I was still exploring my own emotions, and of course, all these really, really strong emotions of love were so dominant in my mind that I think that together with that sort of Taoist philosophy in a way made me keep that at bay. But I still think that it changed me. I still think it affected me a lot and quite deeply. And there are some poems in these collections that are about that as well, although not directly. Now, there will be at least one of my unfinished poems is one where I actually reveal a little bit more about the experience of my mother dying. So I'll not talk too much about that right now, but it is part of that phase in my life that led to poetry writing being what for me was actually rather therapeutic and also a necessary thing for me to understand what I was feeling. There is one aspect of this that actually occurred to me also at the time, I think, as well. So let's say you have been in love with someone, they know that you're in love with them, they might be in love with someone else, and so at some point you might try a little bit too hard to get closer to them, and so they have to cut you out of their lives. True story, it did happen. My fault, of course. I was warned that this would happen if I did that, if I tried too much, and if I did, yeah. So it's not her fault at all, of course. Because it's my behavior came from a position of immaturity and naivety and inexperience. And of course she had more experience with these kinds of things, so she knew that happened before. She had other people that she'd had um to get out of her life, at least temporarily, to keep them at a distance because they fancied her too much. But one thing I realized when I was writing in when I was trying to process this, which is a kind of grief, and of course this is a different kind of grief than from the loss of a mother. The grief of unrequited love is very, very different, because when you lose a loved one, like your parent, sometimes there might be things that weren't said. There might be some unprocessed guilt, things like that. I didn't really have that much, I think, when it comes to things like that. But when you have grief that is for lost love, unrequited love, you have a lot of regrets about things you might have done differently that could have led to the love being requited, for instance. That's one thing. So you regret things you said, things you've done. You're wondering, what could I have done differently, and should I have done that and said that instead of that, etc. There's other things like that, and of course, at some point, you realize there is no way back to where you came from, and to that position where you had the option, we had the possibilities of it becoming something more. But by writing about it, you're not just processing it, but you're also wallowing in your misery again. So that's where that's keeping your sorrow comes back a little bit. And of course, I was thinking about that too when I was writing the recent poem that I made on the subject of wallowing in one's misery and wanting to be hurt. So by writing about pain, you may be able to process it, but you also might amplify it and perpetuate it. So it is a double-edged sword, and you have to be really careful about these things. In my case, I think that in the long run, it certainly helped to have written about it. So I don't regret doing that now, but I was rather down a lot of the summer of 1994 because of this particular thing happening. So, and also this is something that I included in that new poem of mine as well. The thing is that even though I was rather down the summer of 94, in autumn 94 I fell in love again, and then I sort of was back on top again, and then I started writing poems about that again. It was a love that didn't quite work out. It had potential, but it just didn't, yeah, things didn't really go the right way. But I did actually end up writing a lot of poems from again from a sort of a positive position of that sort of initial trying to approach someone and express my love for them, and not just the unrequitedness and the grief from being spurned, etc., those kinds of things. So it's quite different. And all this was part of a process. But another thing I wanted to say is sort of along the same line. So this is when I was 18 to 20 years old. And just to put that into perspective, that's 30 years ago now. And I was very young and inexperienced and quite innocent, probably, when it came to emotions. I didn't understand my own emotions. I didn't understand the emotions of other people. And especially the understanding of other people's emotions is something that has taken me actually a long time afterwards to get to as well. So many of the poems that are in these collections, and perhaps especially in 1994, are written from the viewpoint of someone who doesn't understand emotions particularly well, and perhaps also has the inexperience of not being that well versed, wordplay intended, when it comes to writing poetry. So I did, when I was working on these new poetry collections, I did actually sift out and remove many of the more juvenile and naive poems from that I have published before. I actually removed those, sometimes because some of the themes had been sort of worked over several times, and sometimes there was one expression of that particular idea that I liked better. So I removed several of those, but I did keep some as well. And I wanted to say something about that because I don't want to apologize for it, but I want to explain it. So I do have several poems in these three collections now that when you read them, you might think they're a bit childish, a bit naive. But the thing is that for me, they're a kind of snapshot of how I actually felt and that particular evolution of emotion that I needed to go through. And I think that as such, they have a certain value in themselves as well. Another thing is that as inexperienced as they may seem, I think actually a poem expressing that, because a poem expresses itself as well, it's kind of a poem is a meta text in many ways. It is self-referential almost by necessity. And I think that the expression of inexperience in a poem that's written by someone who is clearly inexperienced is something that is still interesting to read. I think it is interesting to read, and I hope others do as well, because it displays that innocence, that inexperience, that naivety, that sort of search for something more, and also that search for that emotional growth. You might not even realize that you're searching for emotional growth, but you're certainly searching for the meaning of emotions, and that leads to emotional growth. If you don't search for the meaning of emotions or try to process what you may have done wrong when it comes to emotions in the relationship with others, then of course you will never mature as a person. You will never have mature emotions. You will keep making the same mistakes over and over again and wondering what's wrong with the other person, because then you're not blaming yourself. But it's very important, I think, to, even though it's not your fault, to blame yourself, in the sense that you want to find out how to do better and how to be better and how to understand better both your own emotions and the emotions of someone else. Okay, so and you will notice when you read these poetry collections, if you do read them, that there is different levels of maturity presented in different poems. And of course, because I now over the last few months have been adding verses to many poems, you will also find some poems that start out maybe a little bit naive, and then they move a little bit, and it's almost like you can see the progress of 30 years throughout the poem a little bit, hints of it, where it ends on a thought that it didn't really start with, that comes from a place of more experience. Or it is sometimes a better expression of the idea of the original, not necessarily something that is more mature in itself, but that is a more mature, a more experienced way of expressing it in a poem. Yeah, yes, I hope that's clear. Actually, that leads me on to one more thing as well, because I had a little idea about that as well. The thing, it's very hard to say of a poem that is good or bad. People will do that. They will do it a lot. But when it comes to art, what is art and what isn't art is something that you can actually define objectively. But what is good art and bad art is something that is very hard to define objectively, because what one person likes is what someone else might hate. But I realized there is actually one sort of semi-objective way of evaluating poetry, not the Pritchard scale, I would add, but if a poem is an expression usually of a thought or an idea or a feeling, or sometimes it's a narrative as well, but mostly it's about a snapshot of a life. And I think that, and of course it established as a kind of form, a pattern, a linguistic pattern that it uses to describe that particular thing that it is trying to accomplish. And once you've established a linguistic pattern, you can sort of measure semi-objectively whether it follows its own pattern consistently, whether it uses words of the same kind of elevation, or whether it's high or low, really, whether it follows its own patterns of rhythm, its own patterns of rhyme, and if it breaks those, whether that's a deliberate part of the expression. So once you write a poem, you start establishing a pattern, both of the idea of what you're trying to express and also how you're expressing it, and the consistency with which you follow that pattern, and the obviousness of any breaks in that pattern in trying to further the idea of it, makes it possible to create a kind of objective evaluation of whether it's a good poem or not. So just to try to say that a little bit more shortly. So if a poem is the best possible expression of its concept, then it's a good poem. It doesn't matter how simple the poem is, or how simplistic the theme of it is, or how inexperienced the emotions are. If it is a way of expressing those things in a way that is self-consistent, then it is a good poem. If it doesn't do it consistently, then it can be said to be an objectively bad poem. And one thing that always gets my goat, by the way, when it comes to poetry, is people who mix up singular you with the old-fashioned thou in the same poem, because that stylistically it doesn't go. So you're breaking the pattern you establish once you say thou, quite old-fashioned, But of course, then you have to keep doing it all the way through the poem. If you don't follow that through all the way through the poem, then it is a stylistic inconsistency, and that makes it a worse poem objectively. That's just an example. It can, of course, be many other things. But that's one thing. So I've been rambling on for a really long time now, but I think I've actually managed to say some really good and important things about poetry in general. And I've certainly said some things that are quite specific to my own poetic journey, and it has to do with certainly starting out 1994, of course, the most pivotal and most formative year of my poetic journey. How it had to do for me with trying to understand, put into words my own emotions and in relation to others, and of course my attempts at establishing a more personal relationship with people of the opposite sex, I suppose, which failed miserably until a few years later. Right. This video is getting quite long. I'm sure you'll be relieved to find that I will soon come to a close. I'm just wondering if there's anything else I wanted to say about these poems right now. I don't think so. I think I've actually covered a lot in this video, and including many things that I wasn't expecting to cover, because this particular subject and many of the thoughts I've had on them are things that I wasn't sure if I would be able to express them in a way that I found well structured and that I thought would flow rather well. But I think I've accomplished it decently well in this video. Quite complex things, and these are things that might have been easier for me to express if I actually had scripted this video, but of course this is just improvised now. I think I'll leave you with that thought for now, or those thoughts. And again, if you want to support my channel, I think that one of my favorite ways that you can do that now, at least it will be one of the most enjoyable for me, is if you buy one of these poetry collections, whether it is for yourself or someone else. There will be more videos, of course, about poems. I will do more poetry readings from these and talk more specifically about single poems from these. And of course, now every time that I do a poetry reading from these, I will point out which book the specific poem is from as well. Right, and I should add that, of course, to my previous videos where I've done poetry readings of my own poems. So, I quite enjoy, by the way, I must say, and right at the end, so because of the situation I was in when I started writing these poems, and many of the poems are to me deeply personal, and also things that feel very self-revelatory. So it feels like it reveals something secret about me and my feelings and my emotions that I normally wouldn't show to anyone. Certainly not for a really long time. So back in 1994, I was definitely trying to hide behind a mask. I didn't want to show these emotions to anyone, apart maybe to one person, certainly at the time, and even then, maybe through the kind of code of writing it in poetic form as well, because a poem can also be a way to not say something explicitly, but also to say it implicitly. You sort of try to mask the message in a way, while at the same time revealing it. So it's a kind of strange duality that poetry can have. But to me, my poetry felt very personal and very revelatory, and so I was quite loath actually to publish my poems for a while, because it felt so personal and like I was revealing something that could make someone hurt me, even. But of course now I don't feel that anymore. I'm much more secure in myself and my emotions, and in a different place of my life where these things are easier. And of course I do have the distance of 30 years now to some of these poems, which is enough for me to say more about them and actually be a little bit more candid and honest and explicit about exactly what was going on, although I'm not going to mention any names, of course, about the people that inspired the poems. If they watch this, they might know who they are. But generally, of course, I'm not going to say too much about that. There are a few names actually mentioned in the poetry collections, without really revealing too much about the surrounding things going on around that whatever relationship I had with them at the time. So I think that's enough for today, and I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you do have any comments about any of the subjects I've broached in this video when it comes to writing poetry or emotions or anything like that, please leave them in the comments, and please buy my books, and I'll see you in the next one. So thanks for watching, and goodbye for now.